I was 9 years old that autumn, and I have told this story so many times since that I sometimes cannot remember which parts are my own memory, and which parts I only remember because Torin has told them so many times back to me. But I remember the fair. I remember the smell of hot cider and sawdust and horsehair, and I remember exactly what my step-grandmother said to me, word for word, because I have turned it over in my mind 1,000 times since, trying to understand how something so small and so kind could have caused so much trouble. This is the story of the day half the kingdom decided they understood Queen Consort Morwenna better than her own family did. They were wrong. And by the end of it, they knew they were wrong, though it took my brother and me to show them. It was the second Saturday of the harvest season, the day of the Fenbridge Founders' Fair, which our family had attended every year since before I was born. Fenbridge sits in the river valley below the palace at Harrogate, close enough that we could walk the last stretch from the motorcade if the weather held, and that year it held beautifully. Cool, bright, the kind of blue-skied morning that makes the whole of Eldermore look freshly painted. My father and mother, Crown Prince Rowan and Princess Alara, were away that week on a state visit to the coast, so it fell to grandfather King Alaric and Morwenna to bring Torin and me to the fair, which they did gladly. Morwenna loved Founders' Day. She said it was the one day of the year when nobody expected her to be anything other than a woman walking through a market with her family, and I think that was true, right up until it wasn't anymore. I should explain, before I go any further, what an ordinary week with Morwenna actually looked like, because I think it matters to understanding why what happened afterward struck our family so hard. She was not, whatever the papers occasionally implied in the years before I was old enough to read them for myself, a distant or formal presence in our lives. She was the one who taught me to press flowers, and the one who kept a small tin of peppermints in her desk drawer for exactly the sort of afternoon when a 9-year-old needed something to do with her hands while the grown-ups talked business nearby. She read to Torin and me on alternating nights with Mistress Ivy, doing all the voices badly on purpose, because it made us laugh harder than doing them well ever could have. She had strict opinions about bedtimes and manners and the proper way to address a servant, opinions she enforced consistently and without exception, and I understood, even at 9, that this consistency was itself a kind of love, the kind that does not waver depending on her own mood or hours or the day. She was strict, in other words, in the plain, old-fashioned sense of the word, the sense that has nothing at all to do with coldness. She corrected us often in small ways, the way any careful guardian corrects a child a dozen times a week without either of us thinking twice about it. A reminder to sit properly at table, a firm word when Torin left his tools scattered across the nursery floor, a quiet instruction that I say thank you to the kitchen staff and mean it. None of it had ever once felt, to either of us, like anything other than what it was. A woman who had decided, long before either of us could remember deciding anything, that she would rather be respected by 2 children who understood boundaries than adored by 2 children who did not. I did not know, that bright Saturday morning setting out for the fair, that this same ordinary, consistent firmness, the very quality that made her someone Torin and I trusted absolutely, was about to be the thing the rest of the kingdom misunderstood most completely. We had been there perhaps an hour, long enough to eat honeyed nuts from a paper cone and watch the sheepdog trials, when Torin spotted the clockmaker's stall and pulled me toward it before Morwenna or grandfather could catch up. Master Bevan had kept that stall at Fenbridge longer than either of us had been alive. A stooped, patient old craftsman with ink-stained fingers who built tiny working models of mills and carriages out of brass gears no bigger than a fingernail. He was in the middle of explaining to a cluster of grown-ups how a particular gear train made a model water wheel turn, and Torin, who loved machines more than almost anything, simply could not wait. He shoved between 2 adults, planted himself at the front of the little crowd, and said loudly, over Master Bevan's own voice, "That's wrong. It's not the big gear that turns it. It's the little one. I've read about this," and kept talking, explaining his own theory of gear ratios to a table of strangers while the old man stood there with his mouth still open around the sentence my brother had interrupted. I did not see all of it happen, because at the very same moment I had noticed the paddock behind the clockmaker's stall, where the fair kept the shire horses that pulled the harvest wagons, enormous gentle-eyed animals with feathered hooves the size of dinner plates, and there was a rope strung between two posts with a small sign that said, quite clearly, "Please keep back horses." I did not read the sign. I saw a foal nosing at the fence and I wanted to touch its nose, and I ducked under the rope before I had thought about it at all, which is the sort of thing I did fairly often at 9 and almost never do now. I do not know which of us Morwenna reached first. I only know that she arrived at both of us within the space of perhaps 4 seconds, moving faster than I had ever seen her move at a public event, her hand closing gently but firmly around my arm just above the elbow and drawing me back under the rope while her other hand landed on Torin's shoulder and turned him. Not roughly, just enough that he stopped talking and looked at her. "Torin," her voice was low, not a whisper but pitched for the two of us and no one else, the particular voice she used when she meant business and did not want an audience. "You interrupted Master Bevan while he was speaking. That was rude, and I think you already know it was rude, so I am not going to explain to you why. I am going to wait while you apologize to him properly." Torin went red. He is 11, old enough to feel the sting of being caught out in front of people, and for a moment I thought he might argue because he does not love being told he is wrong about machines. But he looked at Master Bevan's patient, slightly startled face, and something in him deflated, and he said, "I'm sorry, sir. That was rude of me." "Please go on," and meant it. And Master Bevan, who had raised a great many children of his own, only smiled and said no harm done, and went back to his water wheel as though nothing at all had happened. Then Morwenna turned to me, and she did the thing she always did when she needed me to actually hear her, which was to go down on one knee in the sawdust in her good coat so that her face was level with mine. "Maelin, look at me, please." I looked at her. Her eyes were not angry. They were serious, which is a different thing, and I understood the difference even then. "You went under a rope marked for horses without asking anyone. Those animals are enormous and they are strangers to you, and a startled horse can hurt a person very badly without meaning to at all. I need you to promise me you will never duck under a rope like that again anywhere for any reason without an adult beside you. Can you promise me that?" "I promise," I said, and I meant it, because I was a little frightened, now that she had put it that way, of how close I had been standing to a hoof the size of a dinner plate. "Good. And I think the foal's owner deserves an apology too, for startling her animal, don't you?" I did apologize to a woman in a green cap who told me kindly that it was no matter, foals startle at everything, and that was the whole of it. The entire exchange, start to finish, cannot have taken 90 seconds. Morwenna stood, brushed the sawdust from her knee, took my hand and Torin's shoulder and steered us both back toward grandfather, who had arrived a few steps behind her. And by the time we reached him she was already telling us, in an entirely different, lighter voice, that there was a honey cake stall near the bandstand, and she intended to have one before Torin ate the fare out of them. Torin laughed. I laughed. Within 5 minutes we were sitting on a low stone wall eating honey cake and watching a puppet show. And if you had asked either of us that afternoon whether anything troubling had happened, we would have looked at you strangely and said no, nothing at all. Why would you ask? The puppet show that year was the old story of the fox and the miller's daughter, which I had seen performed at Fenbridge every autumn of my life and never once tired of. And Torin, who considered himself far too old for puppet shows and always said so loudly beforehand, sat through the whole thing without complaint and laughed harder than I did at the fox's ridiculous disguises. Grandfather bought us each a paper twist of roasted chestnuts from a brazier near the bandstand, and stood with his hands warming over the coals while the vendor, an old woman who had sold chestnuts at Fenbridge for as long as Master Bevan had sold clockwork, told him at some length about her grandchildren, and did not seem to mind in the slightest that she was telling it to the King of Eldermore. That was the strange, ordinary magic of Founder's Day. I have always thought, for one afternoon a year, in that one river valley, we were simply a family at a fair, and everyone we met treated us that way, because that was the spirit the day itself seemed to insist on. Morwenna spent a good part of that afternoon with her arm looped easily through mine, the way she often did when we walked together, pointing out things she thought I would like. A stall of pressed flower bookmarks, she said, reminded her of our Sunday afternoons with her botany books, a dour-faced sheep that had won a blue ribbon and looked, she said, as though it resented every moment of the attention. She has a particular laugh, low and quick, that she almost never lets slip in front of cameras, and I heard it twice that afternoon, once at the sheep and once when Torin, still glowing with his half-right theory about the water wheel, tried to explain gear ratios to her using a candied apple and very nearly dropped it in the grass. I did not think, watching her laugh with sticky apple juice narrowly missed on her good coat, that I was looking at a woman anyone could reasonably call cold. I only thought, the way children think about things that are simply true and do not need proving, that I was glad she was mine. We stayed until the lamps were lit along the green, and the last of the harvest wagons had rattled off toward the farms, and it was well past both our bedtimes by the time Grandfather finally admitted the day had to end. I did not know then that a woman named Della Hartwick, who ran the wool stall 2 rows over and had come out from behind her table to see what the commotion by the paddock was about, had taken out her telephone and recorded the last 20 seconds of it, the part where Morwenna's hand was on my arm, and her face was serious, and neither of our voices could be heard over the noise of the fair. I did not know that Della had watched a great many stories over the years about Queen Consort Morwenna being cold, or grasping, or hard on the family that was not born to her, and that she watched those 20 seconds of silent footage already halfway convinced of what she was seeing. I did not know that by the time we were finishing our honey cakes, Della had posted that clip online with 3 sentences beneath it that would end up traveling farther and faster than any of us, and that the caption did not mention Master Bevan's water wheel, or the rope, or the foal, or the words, "I promise," at all. I only knew, walking back to the motorcade that evening with sawdust still on the hem of my dress and honey still on my fingers, that it had been, by any measure I understood at 9 years old, an ordinary and rather lovely day. Grandfather carried me the last 100 yards on his shoulders because my feet hurt from walking. Morwenna and Torin argued cheerfully the whole way about whether the little gear or the big gear really did turn the water wheel, and Torin was delighted, later that week, when Master Bevan sent a small brass model to the palace, with a note saying the boy had actually been half right, and would he like to come by the stall next year and learn to build one himself. I remember thinking, as I fell asleep that night, that it had been a very good Founder's Day, possibly my favorite one yet, and that Morwenna, who had knelt in the sawdust in her good coat to make sure I understood about the horses, was exactly the kind of step-grandmother I was lucky to have. It took 4 days for the rest of the kingdom to disagree with me, and when they did, they disagreed loudly enough that even a 9-year-old in the nursery wing of the palace at Harrogate could not help but notice something had gone badly wrong. The first I understood of it was small and easy to miss. On the Wednesday after the fair, I came down to breakfast to find my grandfather already at the table, not eating, holding his telephone at arm's length the way he does when he does not want his spectacles, and Morwenna standing behind his chair reading over his shoulder with an expression I had never seen on her before. It was not anger, and it was not sadness exactly. It was closer to the look of someone who has been struck somewhere soft, and is trying very hard not to let it show. "What is it?" I asked, climbing into my chair. "Nothing that concerns you, sweetheart," Morwenna said, and smiled at me, and the smile was real, but it did not reach all the way up into her eyes the way it usually did. Eat your breakfast. Is that porridge getting cold? I ate my porridge. I did not think about it again until that afternoon, when I went looking for Torin in the library and found him instead hunched over one of the study computers with our tutor, Mistress Ivy, standing behind him with her arms crossed, both of them staring at the screen with the particular stillness of people who have just watched something they cannot unwatch. "What are you looking at?" I said. Torin turned the screen away from me so fast he nearly knocked over the inkwell. "Nothing." "Homework." "It is very obviously not homework, Torin. You don't hide homework." Mistress Ivy, who has never in her life been able to lie convincingly to either of us, said, "It's grown-up business, Maelin, truly, and it will sort itself out. Why don't you go and see whether the kitchens have any of those apple tarts left?" I went and found the apple tarts. I was 9, not stupid, and I understood perfectly well that something had happened, and that it had something to do with the fair, and that no one in the palace intended to tell me what it was. I decided, the way children do, that if the grown-ups would not tell me, I would simply have to find out for myself. It took me 3 more days, and by the time I did find out, the trouble had grown so large that it no longer fit quietly into a corner of the palace at all. It had become the sort of story that people all over Eldermore were shouting about in newspapers and on the evening broadcasts, and in the comment threads under Della Hartwick's 20 seconds of silent video. And every single one of them was certain, in the way that strangers are always certain about things they only half saw, that they understood exactly what kind of woman Queen Consort Morwenna was. They did not understand at all. But I am getting ahead of myself, because to tell this properly, I have to go back and explain how something so small became something so large, and I did not understand that part myself until much later, when Morwenna finally sat me down and told me the whole of it plainly, the way she told me everything once she decided I was old enough to hear it. Della Hartwick was not, I want to say clearly, a cruel woman. I never met her that day at the fair, not properly, but I met her much later, and I came to understand that she had spent 11 years running her wool stall at Fenbridge and raising 2 children of her own on very little help from anyone, and that she had a soft spot, the kind that runs right through a person, for anything that looked like a child being handled roughly. She had also, over the years, read a great many stories about Morwenna in the papers she bought at the corner shop, stories that were, as it happens, almost entirely untrue, or true only in the way a shadow is true to the shape that casts it. She had read that Morwenna had once demanded a family heirloom that was never hers to demand. She had read, wrongly, that Morwenna had been unkind to my mother when my mother first joined the family. She had read whispers, printed as near facts, that the Queen Consort held herself apart from her husband's grandchildren, that she tolerated us rather than loved us, that there was a coldness in the way she wore her position that never quite thawed. None of it was true. But Della Hartwick had read it so many times, in so many places over so many years, that by the time she looked up from her wool stall and saw the Queen Consort's hand close around a small girl's arm, she did not see a woman catching a child before a horse could hurt her. She saw the ending of a story she had already been told the beginning of 100 times. She filmed 22 seconds. She trimmed off the first 2, where you could just make out Morwenna's face bending down to horse height and softening, because, she told a reporter much later with real shame in her voice, she had not thought those 2 seconds looked dramatic enough. She wrote beneath the clip, "A child should not look this frightened of a grown woman. Watch her face." This is not the first time we've heard whispers about how QC Morwenna treats children who aren't hers. Someone needs to ask questions. She posted it on the Wednesday morning, 3 days after the fair, meaning to reach perhaps the few hundred people who usually saw her posts about wool prices and lambing season. By Wednesday evening, it had been seen by more people than lived in the entire town of Fenbridge. By Thursday, it had reached the newspapers, which is how it came to be on my grandfather's telephone at breakfast, held out at arm's length, his face doing the thing faces do when they are trying not to show how much something hurts. I did not know any of that yet, on the Wednesday or the Thursday. What I knew was smaller and stranger. That Morwenna, who had always come to say good night to Torin and me herself, sent Mistress Ivy in her place 2 nights running with an excuse about a headache. That grandfather's voice, usually so even, had an edge in it I had never heard when he spoke to the members of his private office who came and went from his study more often than usual that week, their arms full of folders. That a Sunday outing we had been promised, a picnic along the river with the new foals from the royal stud, was quietly moved to sometime later in the month, without anyone quite explaining why. Children notice absences more than they notice presences. It was not any one thing that told me something was wrong. It was the shape of all the small things that had gone missing. On the Friday, I finally understood, and I understood it in the worst possible way, which was by accident. I had gone down to the East Gallery after my lessons to look for grandfather, who sometimes let me sit in the window seat there and read while he worked through his afternoon papers, because the light was good and he did not mind the quiet company. The gallery door was open a crack, and before I reached it I heard voices, his and Morwenna's, pitched low but not quite low enough, and something in the tone of them made me stop in the corridor instead of walking straight in. The way you stop on a stair when you hear something that tells you the room ahead is not a room you were meant to enter yet. "I want to release a statement today," my grandfather was saying. "I want the palace press office to say, in plain words, exactly what happened at that fair, and I want whoever runs that account named and held to account for what she's done to my family's reputation. And I am telling you that will make it worse, Alaric." Morwenna's voice was steady, but there was something under the steadiness, something worn thin. "If the palace comes out swinging at a wool merchant from Fenbridge, the story stops being about a woman correcting 2 children at a fair. It becomes the crown against an ordinary citizen. We will win that fight and lose everything that matters about it. And Torin and Maelin will be dragged through every headline twice over instead of once. They're already being dragged through it. Have you seen what they're writing about you? About the way you handle them, half the kingdom thinks." "I know what half the kingdom thinks." Something in her voice cracked, just slightly, just for a moment, and then was smoothed over so quickly I almost believed I had imagined it. "I have known what half the kingdom has thought of me since the week your first wife's memory decided I would always be measured against a woman I never had the chance to compete with, and lost to before I ever opened my mouth. This is not new to me, Alaric. It is only new to you, watching it happen to me over something that actually was not my fault in the smallest degree." There was a silence then, long enough that I very nearly turned and walked away, ashamed of myself for listening at all. And then I heard my grandfather say, more gently than before, "Then tell me what you want to do instead, because I cannot simply do nothing while they call my wife cruel to my own grandchildren." "I want to do nothing today," Morwenna said. "I want to let it burn for one more day, because anything we say today will sound like panic, and panic reads as guilt to people who are already looking for guilt. And then, if it hasn't cooled on its own by tomorrow, we will say something true and simple and brief, and we will not apologize for something I did not do wrong. I corrected 2 children in a manner any decent parent corrects a child 100 times a year, Alaric. I will not stand in front of the kingdom and apologize for that, whatever else I am willing to bear." I did not go into the gallery that day. I went back to the nursery instead, and I sat on my bed for a long time with a book open in my lap that I did not read a single word of, turning over what I had heard, understanding for the first time that the strange quiet of that week had a name, and that the name was that people, a great many people apparently, people I would never meet, believed that Morwenna had been unkind to me. At the one moment in that entire fair when I had felt, if anything, more looked after than I had ever felt in my life, kneeling in the sawdust with her hand steady on my arm and her eyes serious and kind, promising me she only wanted me safe. I did not sleep well that night. I kept thinking about her voice on the other side of that door. I have known what half the kingdom has thought of me since the week your first wife's memory decided I would always be measured against a woman I never had the chance to compete with. And I did not fully understand it yet, the weight of years it carried. But I understood enough to know that this was not the first time Morwenna had been unfairly judged, and that she had built over those years a kind of armor for it that let her stand very still and very calm while people said cruel things about her. I understood, lying awake in the dark, that the armor was not the same thing as not being hurt. It was only what hurt looked like on a woman who had decided, a long time before I was born, that she would not let anyone see the wound. I thought that night of something my mother had told me once, long before any of this happened, when I was small enough that I do not remember asking the question that must have prompted it. We had been sitting in the nursery, and I must have said something careless about Morwenna, the way children repeat things they have half overheard without understanding them, and my mother had set down whatever she was doing and told me, quite seriously for a woman who rarely spoke seriously to me about grown-up things, that I ought to be careful about believing everything I heard about my step-grandmother. She told me that when she herself had first come to the palace as a young bride, frightened and homesick and certain everyone was judging her, it had been Morwenna, of all people, who had quietly arranged for a portrait of my mother's own late mother-in-law, my grandfather's first wife, the Queen Isolde whom my father had loved so dearly and lost so young, to be hung in my mother's private sitting room without ever once mentioning that she had done it. My mother had only worked out, months later from a steward's careless remark, whose doing it had actually been. When my mother finally thanked her for it, Morwenna had simply said that a new bride ought to be surrounded by the people who loved her, even the ones who could only be present in a frame, and had changed the subject before my mother could say another word about it. She does a great many kindnesses that way, my mother had told me, quietly, and without wanting thanks for them, because I think somewhere along the way she decided that anything she did loudly would only be picked apart and turned against her. It is a very lonely way to be kind, Maelin, and I hope you will remember it, because most people never see that side of her at all. They only see the parts of her that learned, a long time ago, to hold very still and give nothing away. I had not thought of that conversation in a long while, but it came back to me whole that night, lying in the dark turning over the sound of Morwenna's voice through the gallery door, and it settled something in me that had been shifting uneasily since breakfast on Wednesday. I understood, perhaps for the first time in a way that would stay with me, that I had spent 9 years being loved by a woman who had quietly decided, long before I was born, that love given without expectation of credit was safer than love given in the open, where it could be seen and misread and used against her. It did not seem fair to me. It still does not. But understanding it made me love her differently that night than I had before, not less, but with my eyes open, the way you love someone once you have finally seen the whole of them rather than only the parts they let show. I decided that night that I would find Torin in the morning and tell him everything I had heard. I did not yet know what either of us could possibly do about it, but I knew, with the fierce and simple certainty that children have before the world teaches them to doubt themselves, that I was not going to let it stand. I found Torin at breakfast the next morning before either grandfather or Morwenna had come down, and I told him everything, in a whisper, leaning across the table so close our foreheads nearly touched over the toast rack. I told him about the argument I had overheard, about the video Mistress Ivy had been so quick to hide, about the words cruel to my own grandchildren and half the kingdom. Torin listened without interrupting, which for Torin is its own kind of proof that he understood how serious it was, and when I finished he sat back and was quiet for a long moment, turning his fork over and over in his fingers. "That's not what happened," he said finally, quietly furious in the particular way Torin gets furious, which is not loud at all but goes very still and very pale. "I was there. Nobody made me apologize because they were cruel to me. I apologized because I was rude and she was right, and I knew it before she even said anything. That's not Maelin. That's not what it looked like at all. I know, I said. I was there too. Then why does anyone believe it? I did not have an answer for that, not then. I only knew that the not knowing sat in my stomach like a stone all through my lessons that morning, through Mistress Ivy's careful, distracted teaching, through a lunch neither of us ate much of. By early afternoon, I could not bear it any longer, and I told Torin I was going to find Morwenna and ask her outright. Whatever the grown-ups thought was or was not my business to know, because it seemed to me that if the whole story was about the two of us, then the two of us had some right to hear it plainly rather than in overheard pieces through a half-open door. We found her in her private sitting room, the small one that looks out over the herb garden, sitting very upright in the chair by the window with a folder of papers open on her lap that she did not appear to be reading. She looked up when we came in, and for just a moment, before she composed herself, I saw something on her face I had never seen there before, not the serious but kind look from the fair, but something closer to tiredness worn all the way down to the bone. "There you are," she said, and set the folder aside, and her voice was warm, determinedly ordinary. "Come in, both of you. Is something the matter?" "We know," I said before I could lose my nerve. "About the video, about what people are saying. We heard you and grandfather talking yesterday in the gallery. I'm sorry we listened. We shouldn't have. But now that we know, we want you to tell us the truth, please, all of it, because Mistress Ivy keeps saying it's grown-up business and it isn't. It's about us. It happened to us, and nobody has told us anything at all." I watched her decide, in the space of perhaps 3 seconds, whether to send us away with another gentle deflection or to actually answer me. I have thought about that decision often since, because I think it was the moment everything really turned. Not the fair itself, not even the argument I overheard, but this. The moment Morwenna chose to trust 2 children with the truth instead of protecting us from it. She set the folder down entirely, and she patted the cushion beside her, and when we had both sat, one on either side of her, she told us plainly, without softening it more than honesty required, what had happened. She told us about Della Hartwick's 22 seconds, and the 2 she had trimmed off the front. She told us what the caption said, and that it had been read, by that morning's count, by more people than lived in every town in the valley put together. She told us that newspapers had picked it up, and that 2 of them had run old, false stories alongside it. One claiming she had once demanded a jewel that was never hers. One claiming she had been cold to our mother when our mother first married into the family, stitched together to make it look as though the fair was simply the latest chapter in a pattern that had never actually existed. She told us when Torin asked directly that yes, people online had used ugly words about her, words I will not repeat here, and that yes, it had hurt, more than she wanted either of us to see. "But it happened to me," I said, and I could hear my own voice climbing toward something close to tears, though I was trying very hard not to cry. "You didn't do anything wrong to me. You kept me from getting kicked by a horse. You made me promise to be more careful. That's not a cruel thing. That's the opposite of a cruel thing. Why would anyone?" "Because they don't know you, sweetheart," Morwenna said, and took my hand. They saw 22 seconds without any sound, and they filled in the rest with a story they already believed before they ever watched the clip. That is what happens to people who have spent long enough being written about unfairly. Eventually, the unfair version becomes the one strangers reach for first, whatever the truth actually is. "Then we'll tell them the truth," Torin said, sitting forward, his jaw set in the way it gets when he has decided something and does not intend to be argued out of it. "We were there. We know what happened. If we just say it." "No," her voice was gentle, but it left no room in it at all. "No, Torin, I don't want that, and I want you both to hear me say it plainly. I do not want either of you standing in front of cameras defending me. You are children. This is not your burden to carry, and the moment the two of you are put in front of reporters to answer for grown-up cruelty, the story stops being about an unfair rumor and becomes a story about two royal children being used as a shield, which is worse, not better. Your grandfather and I will handle this the way grown-ups are meant to handle these things. I need you both to promise me you will let us." I promised. Torin, more reluctantly, promised too, though I could see even then that the promise sat uneasily on him, the way a coat sits uneasily on shoulders it does not quite fit. We stayed with her a while longer, the three of us on the window seat with the herb garden going gold below us in the afternoon light, and she told us, when Torin asked in a smaller voice than before, that she was not angry with Della Hartwick, not really, only tired, and that she had decided the palace would issue a short, calm statement the next morning, and that after that, she hoped, the whole business would simply fade the way most such storms eventually do. We had supper together that evening, all four of us, in the small dining room rather than the formal one, which was grandfather's doing, I think, though no one said so directly. It was the first meal in days that had not felt strained. Grandfather asked Torin a great many questions about gear ratios, more, I suspect, than he actually wanted answered, simply to watch Torin's face light up the way it always did when someone let him talk about machines for longer than was strictly necessary. Morwenna asked me about the flowers I meant to press that Sunday, and whether I had decided yet on the violets or the late asters, and for a while the whole table felt almost the way it always had, before any of this began. It was only near the end of the meal, when the plates had been cleared and Torin had gone quiet over a bowl of stewed pears, that grandfather set down his cup and looked at the two of us with an expression I did not often see on him. Not the composed public face he wore for state occasions, but something plainer and more uncertain, the look of a man about to say something he had been turning over for some time. "I want you both to know," he said, "that I am proud of you, not for keeping quiet, though I know Morwenna asked that of you and I know it has not been easy. I am proud of you for coming to her directly and asking for the truth instead of accepting whatever half-answer the rest of us were prepared to give you. That took more courage than either of you probably realizes. Grown-ups do not always deserve that kind of honesty from children, and you gave it to us anyway." "We just wanted to know," Torin said, a little embarrassed, the way he always was when praised directly. "I know. That is precisely why I am proud of you." Grandfather looked at Morwenna then, and something passed between them that I did not fully understand at the time, though I have come to understand it since, the particular look of two people who have been married through enough difficulty together that a hard week, even a very hard week, does not frighten either of them the way it might have once. "Your grandmother has weathered a great many storms in this family, most of them long before either of you were old enough to notice. I am sorry this is the first one loud enough for you to see. I promise you it will not be the last time she is misjudged, because that is, unfairly, part of the life she chose when she married into this family. But I hope it is the last time either of you has to learn about it by accident, through a half-open door. From now on, if something is happening that concerns you, you come and ask. Both of you. Directly. I would rather you hear a hard truth from us than a half-truth from a stranger's telephone." Morwenna reached over and covered his hand with hers briefly, and said nothing at all, which was, I had come to understand by then, often how she said the most important things. I went to bed that night lighter than I had felt in days, believing, as children do when the adults around them finally seem calm again, that calm meant the danger had passed. I did not know yet that it would not fade the way Morwenna hoped. For one evening, at least, warm with supper and grandfather's words still settling in my chest, I let myself believe that the worst of it was already behind us. The statement went out the following morning, brief and carefully worded, over the signature of the palace press office rather than Morwenna's own name, because grandfather's advisors felt, rightly I think, that a statement from her directly would read as too personal, too much like pleading. It said, in essence, exactly what had happened, that Queen Consort Morwenna had given both children a routine safety correction and a manners correction at a public event, that both matters had been resolved within a minute, on the children's own initiative and without distress, and that the family would have no further comment on what it called a private parenting moment that has been taken badly out of context. It named no one. It made no threats. My grandfather, I learned later, had wanted 3 separate sentences taken out for being too sharp, and Morwenna had wanted 2 put back in for being too soft, and what finally went out the door was a compromise that satisfied neither of them entirely, which is often, grandfather told me once, the surest sign that a statement has been written correctly. For about 6 hours it seemed to work. The evening broadcasts that had been building the story all week ran the palace statement more or less straight, without much editorializing, and one commentator I remember grandfather reading aloud at dinner, half in relief, said plainly that the footage, viewed with any context at all, showed nothing more alarming than an ordinary parent stopping a child from wandering near livestock. For one evening, sitting at the family table with grandfather almost smiling again, and Morwenna eating more than a few bites of her dinner for the first time in days, I believed we had come through it. I believed the strange, quiet, wrong week was closing behind us the way bad weather closes behind a ship that has simply outrun it. I was wrong about that too. The storm had not passed at all. It had only paused to gather itself, and by the next morning it came back harder than before, and this time it did not spare Della Hartwick either, though by then she had already begun, quietly, to have doubts of her own about what she had done. What happened, as best as I understand it, having had it explained to me since by people far more familiar with newspapers than I am, was this. The palace's calm statement, precisely because it was calm, gave a certain kind of commentator exactly the opening they needed. If the family was not shouting, they reasoned aloud on their evening programs, then the family must be managing the story rather than answering it. A palace spokeswoman's measured paragraph became, by the next morning's headlines, "Palace scrambles to contain fallout," which is a very different thing to read over one's breakfast than "nothing happened at all," even though both were describing the same 11 sentences. One columnist wrote that it was convenient that both children were, in her words, too young to speak for themselves, as though our silence were something arranged rather than something asked of us out of care. Another dug up and printed beside a still frame of Morwenna's serious face from Della's clip, a photograph from years before I was born, of Morwenna at some long-ago event standing slightly apart from a family group, and wrote beneath it that this, too, fit a pattern, without once mentioning that the photograph had been taken, as it turned out, only seconds before she stepped forward in that exact old story to comfort a crying child who did not belong to her family at all. A fact the columnist either did not know or did not care to include. Della Hartwick, meanwhile, had spent that first quiet evening after the palace statement doing something I did not learn about until much later. She had gone home, watched her own 22 seconds of footage 4 or 5 times over, and sat with a feeling she could not entirely name, somewhere between doubt and shame. She told a reporter afterward that she remembered dimly that there had been more to the clip before she trimmed it, a half-second of the Queen Consort's face bending low, softening, and that she had cut it because it did not fit the story she already believed she was telling. She said she had almost, that first quiet evening, posted something to say she might have been hasty. But by the following morning, her message threads were so full, strangers thanking her for being brave enough to say what everyone was thinking, other strangers accusing her of fabricating the whole thing for attention, a reporter from one of the harsher papers offering to buy an exclusive interview about what she really saw, that the private, uncertain woman who had filmed a foal startled by a princess got buried, almost overnight, under the public figure the story had made of her. She told the truth about her doubts to almost no one that week. Instead, cornered and frightened and not knowing how to walk anything back without it looking like she'd been paid to, she gave the interview, and in it pressed by a reporter who wanted a stronger line than the one she actually believed. She said something close to, "Well, I know what I saw," which read, printed beneath a bold headline the next morning, as though she stood entirely by her first account. The story that had briefly cooled caught fire again, hotter than before. It was not, I should say, as though every voice in the kingdom turned against her. Grandfather told me later that a great many ordinary people wrote into the palace that week, quietly, without the fanfare of an interview or a published column. Letters and messages from parents who said they recognized exactly the kind of correction Morwenna had given us, because they had given the very same correction to their own children 100 times over, and saw nothing at all alarming in it. A schoolteacher from somewhere in the eastern counties wrote a long, thoughtful letter, which grandfather kept and later showed me, arguing that a generation raised to see ordinary boundary setting as cruelty was a generation that would struggle to set boundaries of its own. None of those letters made the newspapers. That was, I have come to understand since, simply the nature of the thing. Agreement rarely travels as fast or as far as outrage does, because outrage announces itself loudly and agreement tends to sit quietly at home, satisfied that the matter needs no further comment. The quiet voices were there the whole time. They were only harder to hear over the louder ones, and it would take something as plain and undeniable as the rope line to finally let them be heard at all. I felt the edge of it myself for the first time on the Monday of the second week, in a way that had nothing to do with newspapers or broadcasts at all. Once a fortnight, a small group of children from the village school below Harrogate came up to the palace grounds for a shared lesson with Mistress Ivy, a tradition Morwenna herself had started years before I was born, meant to keep Torin and me from growing up entirely inside the walls of our own family. I had always looked forward to those Mondays. That particular one, a girl named Rilla, who I had known since I was small enough to barely remember not knowing her, would not quite meet my eyes at lunch, and when I asked her what was wrong, she said, in the awkward, unpracticed way children repeat things they have heard grown-ups say without fully understanding them, that her mother had told her the Queen Consort wasn't very nice to children. And did I want to talk about it? I did not know what to say. I remember my face going hot, and I remember Torin, 2 seats down, going very still in the particular way he does when he is furious and trying not to show it, and I remember Mistress Ivy, who must have overheard, coming to sit beside me for the rest of the meal without saying anything at all about it, simply present, the way she was when she knew a thing could not be fixed with words in the moment it happened. I did not repeat what Rilla had said to anyone that evening. I did not want to give it more weight by carrying it home, but I lay awake that night turning it over all the same, understanding for the first time that this was not only a story happening to Morwenna in newspapers I never read. It had reached my own lunch table, spoken by a girl I liked, repeating words her own mother must have believed enough to say plainly in front of a child. Torin found his own version of it 2 days later at his fencing lesson, when one of the older boys, showing off in the way older boys sometimes do in front of an audience, made a joking remark about getting corrected the royal way that was clearly meant to needle him. Torin told me about it afterward with his jaw set and his voice very controlled, the way he talks when he is angrier than he wants anyone to notice. He had not said anything back. He told me, not because he could not think of anything to say, but because he had promised Morwenna, and because some small, stubborn part of him had already decided, even then, that his answer to it would come later and would come properly, and would not be wasted on a boy who was only repeating something to sound clever in front of his friends. "I'm not angry at Rilla," I told him that night, though I was not entirely sure it was true. "She's just repeating what her mother said. She doesn't know." "That's the whole problem," Torin said. "Nobody who's saying it actually knows." "That's exactly the problem." It was Mistress Ivy, in the end, who tried to help us make sense of it, in the careful, patient way she explained anything she considered genuinely important rather than merely useful for an examination. She sat the two of us down in the schoolroom one gray afternoon, closed the study computer she usually kept open for lessons, and asked us instead what we understood about how a story like this one traveled from a fair in Fenbridge to a breakfast table in every corner of Eldermore within the space of a single week. People believe the first version they see, she said, when neither of us had a very good answer. That is simply how minds work, and it is not a flaw exclusive to foolish people. Clever people do it too, all the time, myself included, if I am honest with you both. Someone sees 22 seconds without any sound, already primed by a dozen other stories to expect the worst, and their mind fills in the rest before they have even finished watching. Once a mind has filled in a story that way, it becomes remarkably difficult to talk it out again, because you are no longer arguing against what a person saw. You are arguing against what they decided they saw, which is a very different and much harder thing to undo. Then how does anyone ever fix it? I asked. Sometimes they don't, she admitted, which was not the answer either of us wanted, but I have come since to respect her for giving it to us plainly rather than promising something she could not be sure of. But sometimes, Maelin, the truth arrives in a form so complete and so undeniable that it simply cannot be argued away. Not a denial, not a statement, but the whole, unedited thing, seen all at once by enough people that no clever framing can shrink it back down to 22 seconds again. That is rare. It takes more than wanting it to happen, but when it does happen, it tends to happen all at once, and it tends to last. I did not fully understand what she meant, not that afternoon. I understood it only much later, at the rope line in Fenbridge, when Torin's voice and mine, unscripted and unguarded, gave the whole kingdom exactly the sort of complete and undeniable truth Mistress Ivy had described. Though if you had told me that afternoon in the schoolroom that it would be the two of us, rather than any grown-up's careful statement, who finally supplied it, I do not think I would have believed you. I did not understand the mechanics of any of that at the time. What I understood, at 9 years old, living inside it, was smaller and more immediate. That the picnic by the river, promised again for that weekend once the first statement seemed to have worked, was cancelled a second time, this time without even an excuse offered. That Morwenna, who had always come herself to say good night, now sent Mistress Ivy 3 nights running, and on the 4th night, when I asked to see her directly, came in looking so pale and composed and careful that I understood, even without being told, that she was holding herself together by main force for my benefit, and would rather I not see what it cost her to do it. That she began, that week, declining small ordinary things she had never declined before, a request to help judge the nursery's harvest drawing contest, an afternoon she usually spent teaching me to press flowers between the pages of her old botany books. Not because she no longer wanted to, I understood later, but because she had grown afraid, genuinely afraid, that anything she did publicly with either of us, however small and however innocent, might be filmed, trimmed, and turned against her again. Grandfather's sister, my grey-tan Adela, tried her own hand at helping that week, and it was watching that attempt fail that taught me, more than anything else had, just how hard the truth was going to be to land. Adela has never in her life been shy about speaking her mind, and she gave a brief, unscripted interview to a respected morning program, in which she said, in her usual blunt and unadorned way, that she had known Morwenna for the better part of 2 decades, that she had never once seen her raise a hand or a harsh word to any child in this family, and that anyone suggesting otherwise on the strength of a silent video clip owed the woman an apology rather than a headline. It was, by any honest measure, exactly the kind of plain, credible testimony the story badly needed. It did not help. Within a day, a handful of commentators had dismissed it as the family closing ranks, as though Adela's decades of knowing Morwenna counted for less than a stranger's 22 seconds simply because Adela loved her. One widely shared piece argued that, of course, a member of the family would defend her, and that this was, if anything, further proof that something needed independent investigation. I remember grandfather reading that particular piece at breakfast with a kind of weary, disbelieving laugh that had no real humor in it at all, and saying, to no one in particular, that he did not know any more what evidence would ever be enough for people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. I understood, watching that fail, exactly why Morwenna had never wanted Torin and me to be the ones to speak. If a grown woman who had known her for 20 years could not be believed, what hope did two children have, offering testimony that could be dismissed just as easily as coached, or protected, or simply too young to be trusted? And yet I noticed something else too, turning it over afterward, which I did not fully understand until the day at the rope line, that everyone who had dismissed Adela's account had done so by calling it staged, or arranged, or spoken on someone's behalf. No one, as far as I ever saw, found a way to dismiss an answer that was neither staged, nor arranged, nor spoken for anyone but ourselves, given to a stranger's question we could not have known was coming. Lord Cassius, Morwenna's own grown son, came to Harrogate for 2 days that same week, having heard of the trouble from his own household some distance away, and I remember being surprised by how quiet his visit was, for a man who had, in years past, occasionally struck me as rather full of his own opinions. He did not give interviews. He did not, as far as I ever learned, say a single public word about any of it. He simply came, sat with his mother for long hours in her private sitting room with the door closed, and on the second evening joined the rest of us for supper looking, I thought, older than I remembered him, and gentler. He offered to have the wool merchant's stall shut down, Morwenna told me once, much later, with a small, rueful shake of her head, as though the memory amused her now in a way it certainly had not at the time. Some old family solicitor's trick involving a market license, I believe. I told him absolutely not, that I would rather bear every unkind word in every newspaper in Eldermore than teach my own son that the answer to being wronged was to ruin an ordinary woman's livelihood over a foolish mistake. He did not much like being told no. But he listened in the end, because he generally does when it matters. I liked hearing that story, once I was old enough to be told it, because it told me something true about both of them, about Cassius, that his temper ran hot in defense of people he loved, however imperfectly he sometimes expressed it, and about Morwenna, that even at the very worst of that fortnight, with her own reputation being torn apart in every newspaper in the kingdom, she had not once been willing to answer unfairness with a cruelty of her own. I have thought of that restraint often since, turning it over the way I turn over most of what happened that autumn, and I have come to think it was, in its own quiet way, every bit as remarkable as anything Torin or I did at the rope line. It is one thing to be patient when you are safe. It is another thing entirely to be patient while you are being wronged, and to insist, the whole time, that the people who wronged you still deserve to be treated fairly. The harvest drawing contest was the clearest example, and the one that stung the most, because it was so small and so entirely without consequence to anyone but me. Every year, the nursery staff pinned up drawings from the youngest children in the household, and the staff quarters, pumpkins and apple trees and wagons piled with wheat, the kind of pictures small children make with more enthusiasm than skill, and every year Morwenna judged them herself, going along the row with real seriousness, crouching down to ask each small artist a question about their picture before awarding a ribbon, because she said every child deserved to be asked about their work as though it mattered. And it always seemed to matter enormously to the children, who talked about the Queen Consort's ribbon for weeks afterward. I had helped her judge it the year before, the two of us going along the row together, and she had promised, back before any of this began, that I could help again. That year a note came instead, brief and apologetic, saying that Lady Verena would judge the drawings in her stead, with no explanation offered beyond a vague mention of scheduling. I did not believe the explanation for a moment. I found her afterward in her sitting room and asked her directly, the way I had learned by then that she preferred to be asked. I could not do it, she admitted, setting aside whatever she had been reading. Not because I did not want to. Because I was afraid, Maelin, genuinely afraid, that if a single photograph existed of me correcting some other family's small child over an untidy pumpkin, it would be printed beside the paddock clip within the day, and I could not bear to be the reason a 5-year-old's drawing of a pumpkin became part of a newspaper story. I know it is a small thing to have taken from you. I am sorry for it all the same. It isn't small to me, I said, more sharply than I meant to, and then, seeing her face softer, I just miss you doing ordinary things with me, that's all. I don't care about the ribbon. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I miss it too, and neither of us said anything else about it, but I noticed, walking away, that she looked as though the conversation had cost her something, and I understood, without either of us saying so, that the fear had begun to take more from her, and from us, than the newspapers themselves ever had. It was Torin who put it into words first, on the Tuesday of the second week, the two of us sitting on the floor of his room with the brass water wheel model Master Bevan had sent, which Torin had taken apart and was slowly, carefully putting back together, the way he does when he is thinking hard about something else entirely. She's pulling away from us, he said, not looking up from the gears. To protect us, but it doesn't feel like being protected, Maelin. It feels like being punished for something we didn't do either. I had not had words for it until he said it, but he was exactly right. The strange, hollow ache I had been carrying for days was not fear, and it was not embarrassment. It was the particular loneliness of watching someone you love pull back from you out of love, and not being able to tell them that the distance hurts nearly as much as whatever they are trying to spare you from. We promised her we wouldn't say anything, I said. I know. But she never said we couldn't feel something about it. Torin looked up at me then, gears forgotten in his hand, and I watched an idea move across his face the way weather moves across a hillside, visible before it arrives. No, he said slowly. She didn't. We did not have a plan yet. I want to be honest about that, because it would be a better story, perhaps, if I could tell you that the two of us sat down that Tuesday afternoon and worked out exactly what we were going to do and how we were going to do it, brave and clever children setting the record straight. It was not like that at all. What we had that Tuesday was only a shared certainty that something had to give, and a promise we had made that we still meant to keep, and a growing, uncomfortable awareness that keeping the promise and fixing what was broken might, somehow, have to be the same thing rather than two different things pulling in opposite directions. The chance to find out came 4 days later, in a way none of us expected, when my grandfather's private secretary came to the nursery himself, which he almost never did, to tell Torin and me that the Fenbridge Autumn Prize-Giving, the small, informal second half of the Founders' Fair, held every year on the last Saturday of the season to award ribbons for the harvest displays, was still on the family's calendar for that weekend, and that the household was divided on whether we ought to attend at all. I learned the shape of that argument the way I had learned most things that fortnight, by sitting very still in rooms where grown-ups had forgotten, or chosen to forget, that I was there. Some of the household advisors thought it plain foolishness to bring either of us anywhere near a camera again, until the story had properly died down, that the safest thing, the only sensible thing, was to send our excuses to Master Bevan and the fair committee, and keep to the palace grounds until the newspapers found some other family to write about. Others, and I believe my grandfather was chief among them, thought that pulling us out of a small country prize-giving we attended every single year would itself become a headline. Royal children kept away after scandal, or something very like it, and would read, to anyone watching, as an admission that there was something to hide, when there had never been anything to hide at all. The palace's chief press secretary, a careful, gray-templed man named Master Corwin, who had served 3 monarchs and had, I gathered, seen a great many storms of this kind come and go over the years, apparently argued for a middle position that satisfied no one entirely. That grandfather and Morwenna should attend, but that Torin and I should stay behind at Harrogate under the excuse of lessons, so that whatever the crowd's mood, at least the two of us would be spared it. I only learned of this proposal because Torin, ever resourceful, had made something of a habit that fortnight of positioning himself within earshot of any room where the household's advisors gathered, and he reported it back to me with real indignation. "They want to leave us behind," he said, "as if we're something breakable that needs to be kept in a cupboard until the weather clears. I don't want to be kept in a cupboard, Maelin. I want to go." I wanted to go too, though I could not have told you exactly why, beyond a stubborn, half-formed conviction that hiding from something unfair felt worse, somehow, than facing it. It was grandfather, in the end, who settled the argument, and settled it, according to Torin's account of the conversation, rather more forcefully than was usual for him. He told Master Corwin that he had already lost 2 weeks of ordinary family life to this business, and that he was not prepared to lose a third by teaching his own grandchildren that the correct response to being misjudged was to disappear from view. Master Corwin, to his credit, did not argue the point further, and turned his considerable competence instead to the practical question of how best to keep us safe amid a crowd he expected to be larger and more chaotic than any prize-giving Fenbridge had ever hosted. Morwenna, when it came to her turn to speak, said the thing that in the end decided it. I did not hear this part myself. Grandfather told me long afterward, sitting with me on the same window seat where she had once told us the truth about Della Hartwick's clip. He said Morwenna had gone very quiet through most of the argument, and then said, simply, that she would not be the reason 2 children were kept from a fair they loved, over a fear that existed only because a stranger had once been unkind to her. That whatever it cost her personally to stand in front of cameras again so soon, she would rather bear that cost than teach Torin and Maelin that the answer to being misunderstood was to hide. "If we do not go," she reportedly said, "then Della Hartwick's 22 seconds will have taken something real from these children's lives, on top of everything else it's already taken from mine. I won't allow that. We go." So it was decided. We would attend the prize giving as a full family, all 4 of us together for the first time since the fair itself, and the household would prepare for the possibility, which everyone now considered a near certainty, that reporters and cameras would be waiting for us in numbers the little country fair had never seen before. Torin found me that evening in the nursery, the brass water wheel finally reassembled and turning smoothly again on his windowsill, and told me, in the careful, deliberate voice he uses when he has thought something through fully rather than blurted it out, that he had decided what he wanted to do at the fair, if anyone gave him the chance to do it. "I'm not going to lie about the promise," he said. "I'm not going to walk up to a camera and make a speech. She asked us not to, and I meant it when I said I would listen to her. But if somebody asks me, if a person, a real person, asks me to my face what happened that day, I am going to tell them the truth. All of it. Because that isn't defending her in front of cameras, Maelin. That's just answering a question honestly, which nobody has ever told me not to do." I thought about that for a long time, lying awake that night with the curtains open to the last of the season's warm air. I thought about the difference between the 2 things Torin had described, a prepared defense, staged in public, which we had promised not to give, and an honest answer to an honest question, which no one had ever asked us not to give. And I decided, somewhere in the small hours, that the difference was real, and that I intended to hold to it exactly the way Torin did, if the chance ever came. I did not know, falling asleep, whether the chance would come at all. I only knew that for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, I fell asleep without that hollow, helpless feeling in my chest, because I finally had something to do with it besides simply carry it around. Torin came to find me again the night before we left for the prize giving, later than either of us was meant to still be awake, and sat on the end of my bed the way he almost never did anymore, now that he considered himself too old for such things. "What if nobody asks?" I said. "What if we go all that way and nobody says anything at all, and it just stays the way it is?" "Then it stays the way it is," Torin said, after a moment, in the careful, deliberate way he had taken to speaking that whole fortnight, as though every sentence had been turned over first and found sound before he let it out. "And we'll have gone anyway and been ordinary, and let her see that we weren't afraid of a crowd just because a crowd had been unkind to her once. That's not nothing, Maelin, even if nobody asks anything at all." "I want someone to ask," I admitted. "So do I," he said. "But I've been thinking about what Mistress Ivy said about people believing whatever they decide to believe. I don't think we can make anyone ask us anything. We can only decide what we'll say if they do." He was quiet for a moment, turning that thought over. "I keep thinking about the horses, actually. How you didn't see the whole paddock before you ducked under that rope. You just saw the one thing you wanted, the foal, and went for it, without looking at what else was standing there. I think that's what happened to everyone who watched Della Hartwick's clip. They saw the one thing they already wanted to see, and they didn't look at what else was standing there either." I thought that was, for an 11-year-old more interested most days in gear ratios than in people, a remarkably wise thing to say. And I told him so, and he went faintly red and told me not to make a fuss about it, and went back to his own room, and I lay awake a good while longer turning his words over, and found that they had settled something in me that had been unsettled since the very first morning at breakfast, weeks before, when I had not understood why my grandfather could not put down his telephone. Saturday came in gray and mild, without the bright harvest sunshine of the first fair, and from the moment our car turned onto the lane above Fenbridge, I understood that this day would look nothing at all like the last one. There were more people lining the road than I had ever seen for a prize-giving, ordinary fairgoers, yes, come for the ribbons and the cider, but also a great many people who were plainly not there for either, cameras slung across their shoulders, notebooks in hand, a line of broadcast vans parked along the green with their aerials raised. Grandfather's security detail had doubled. Morwenna sat very straight beside him in the car, her gloved hands folded in her lap, and I watched her look out at the crowd gathering along the lane and saw her chin lift, just slightly, the particular set of her jaw that I had come to recognize, in the space of 2 weeks, as the look of a woman choosing to walk forward into something rather than away from it. "Are you frightened?" I asked her quietly as the car slowed. She looked at me, and for a moment the composed public face slipped, just enough that I saw the real one underneath, tired and a little raw and entirely, unmistakably brave. "A little," she admitted. "But I would rather be a little frightened here with the two of you beside me than safe somewhere else without you. Stay close to me today, both of you. Whatever happens." We stayed close. We walked the length of the fair as a family, past the harvest displays and the ribbon table in Master Bevan's stall, where the old clockmaker greeted Torin like an old friend, and pressed a small brass cog into his hand, for luck. And all the while I was aware, the way you become aware of weather changing before the first drop of rain falls, of the cameras following us, of reporters calling questions from behind the rope line that the fair committee had strung up further back than usual that year, of a low, watchful murmur running through the crowd that had nothing to do with harvest ribbons at all. It was nearly time for the prize-giving itself, the four of us standing near the small raised platform where Master Bevan, as senior guildsman, would announce the winning displays, when a woman broke from the crowd of onlookers just beyond the rope, not a reporter, I understood later, but simply a fairgoer, drawn forward by the same impulse that makes people lean toward any gathering crowd, and called out, in a voice pitched to carry, a question aimed not at Morwenna at all, but straight at Torin and me. "You two were there, weren't you, at the horse paddock with the Queen Consort? Is it true what they're saying, that she frightened you?" I felt Morwenna go very still beside me. I felt her hand, which had been resting lightly on my shoulder, tense, ready, I think, to draw us both away from the question entirely, to shield us from it the way she had been trying to shield us from everything for 2 weeks. And I understood in that single suspended second that this was the moment Torin had described to me in the nursery. Not a staged defense, not a promise broken, but an honest question asked to our faces by a person who genuinely wanted to know. Nobody had told either of us not to answer it honestly. Torin answered first. "No," he said, and his voice, though it shook a little at the very start, steadied with each word, the way it always did once he was certain of something. "That's not what happened at all." I interrupted Master Bevan. "He's right there, you can ask him. I was rude to him in front of everyone, and Queen Consort Morwenna made me apologize for it, which I should have done on my own without being told. That's all. She wasn't cruel to me. She was right, and I knew she was right, and I still think so." He paused and looked up, not at the woman who had asked the question, but at the wider crowd beyond her, at the cameras he had promised himself he would not perform for and was, I think, no longer performing for at all, only answering. "I've read all the things people have written about her being cold to us. I don't know who told them that, but they've never actually met her because I have, my whole life, and she has never once been anything but fair to me. Fair isn't the same as soft, but fair is what she's always been." I do not remember deciding to speak. I only remember that Torin's voice gave me a kind of courage I had not known I was waiting for, and that the next thing I knew I was speaking too, my own voice smaller than his, but, I hoped, just as clear. "I ducked under a rope by the horses," I said. "I wasn't supposed to. There was a sign and I didn't read it, and there was a foal right there and I wanted to touch it, and I didn't think about how big the other horses were or how easily I could have been hurt. Queen Consort Morwenna got to me before anything happened. She knelt down, she got sawdust on her good coat, kneeling down, so she could look at me properly while she talked to me, and she wasn't shouting, she was never shouting. She just needed me to promise I would be more careful, and I promised, and then we went and had honey cake together, and it was a lovely day. It was one of my favorite days this whole year, until people who weren't even there decided to tell everyone it was something else. My eyes had gone hot and blurry by the end of it, and I did not try to hide it because I found, standing there, that I did not want to. She wasn't unkind to me. She saved me from getting hurt, and then she made sure I understood why it mattered. If that's the worst thing anyone can find to say about her, then I don't understand what everyone has been so angry about. There was a silence after that, the particular silence of a crowd that had come expecting one kind of story and been handed another, entirely unrehearsed, entirely unguarded, standing right there in front of them with sawdust-colored memories and shaking voices, and nothing at all held back. I remember a reporter near the front lowering her notebook without writing anything down. I remember Master Bevan, up on the little platform, nodding slowly to himself as though something he had known all along had simply been confirmed. And I remember Morwenna beside me, not moving at all for what felt like a very long time, her hand still resting on my shoulder, her composed public face entirely, finally undone. She knelt then, the same way she had knelt at the horse paddock 2 weeks before, sawdust and all, and put one arm around each of us, and I felt her shoulders shake once, twice, before she brought herself back under control, and when she spoke it was only for the two of us, though I think half the crowd heard it anyway. "I told you both I didn't want you carrying this," she said, her voice thick. "I meant that, I still mean it." "We didn't carry anything," Torin said. "We just told the truth when somebody asked us. You never said we couldn't do that." She laughed then, a real laugh, wet with tears and entirely unguarded, and held us both a moment longer before she stood, straightened her coat, and turned to face the crowd and the cameras with a composure that was, for the first time in 2 weeks, not armor at all, only her own steady self restored. It was Della Hartwick, as it happened, who stepped forward next out of the crowd near the rope line, her wool stall apron still tied at her waist because she had come straight from her table when she heard the commotion. I recognized her only afterward from the newspapers, but I remember her face clearly even now, pale and stricken and brave in its own way. The way it takes bravery to walk toward the very people you have wronged rather than away from them. "I'm the one who posted that clip," she said to Morwenna directly, her voice not loud but carrying in the sudden quiet. "I want you to know that. I trimmed the front off it because I thought it looked worse that way, and I never should have, and I am more sorry than I know how to say, to you and to these two children both. I believed a story I'd been told so many times I stopped checking whether it was true. I won't make that mistake again." Morwenna looked at her for a long moment. I do not know what I expected, some final, deserved sharpness perhaps, after everything the woman's 22 seconds had cost her. It did not come. "You loved a child you thought was frightened," Morwenna said instead, quietly. "That is not a small thing to have in you, Mrs. Hartwick, even when it leads a person astray. I would rather live in a kingdom full of people too quick to protect a child than one where no one troubles themselves to look at all. Thank you for saying this to my face instead of only to a reporter. That took more courage than the first post did." Grandfather stepped forward then, and the whole green seemed to hold still for him the way it always did when he chose to speak, though he spoke, that day, more plainly than I had ever heard him speak in public before. "I want to say one thing, and then we are going to let Master Bevan get on with the ribbons, because that is what today is actually meant to be about," he said, and there was a ripple of quiet, surprised laughter from the crowd, the tension of the last 2 weeks breaking, just slightly, at the ordinariness of the joke. "I have been angry these past 2 weeks in a way I am not accustomed to being angry, because it is a hard thing for a man to watch his wife judged for loving his grandchildren well. I very nearly said a great many sharp things I would likely have regretted. I did not say them because she asked me not to, and because she was right, as she generally is, that the truth would serve this family better than my temper would. I am glad now that I listened to her. I would ask only this of anyone who believed the worst of her these past 2 weeks, that the next time a story reaches you already looking like an ending, you ask first whether you have actually seen the whole of it. That is all. Thank you for coming today, all of you, ribbons and all." He said it without heat, and without particular eloquence, in the plain, unpolished way he spoke when he meant something more than when he was performing for an audience, and I think that plainness was exactly why it landed as it did. I saw more than one reporter's pen finally move across a notebook page, and I saw Della Hartwick, still standing near us, nod once slowly, as though something in her had settled that had been unsettled for 2 full weeks. I do not think anyone standing near that rope line that afternoon expected the day to end the way it did. By evening, the footage of Torin and me answering that question, unscripted, unrehearsed, filmed by a dozen cameras at once from a dozen different angles, so that no one afterward could claim it had been trimmed or shaped into something it was not, had traveled every bit as far and as fast as Della Hartwick's 22 seconds ever had, and further. It ran complete, all 4 minutes of it, on every evening broadcast that had spent 2 weeks running the shorter, crueler version. The headlines that had called Morwenna cold now called her, with the same appetite for a strong word that had served her so poorly before. The step-grandmother royal children rushed to defend, which was not, perhaps, a perfectly accurate description of what had happened, but came far closer to the truth than anything printed about her in the fortnight before it. Master Bevan, before we left the green that evening, caught Morwenna's sleeve as she passed his stall and pressed something small into her hand without a word, a tiny brass gear, no larger than a button, the kind he sold as good luck tokens to children on their first visit to his stall. "For steadiness," he told her, when she looked at him in some surprise. "I have watched this fair for 40 years, Your Grace, and I have rarely seen anyone hold as steady through as rough a fortnight as you have. That's worth marking." Morwenna kept that small gear afterward in the same desk drawer where she kept her tin of peppermints, and I have seen her, once or twice since, turn it over in her fingers when something difficult crossed her desk, as though it reminded her of exactly what steadiness had bought her once before. We went home to the palace at Harrogate that evening in a car that felt, for the first time in 2 weeks, entirely light. Grandfather could not stop reaching over to squeeze Morwenna's hand, and Torin fell asleep against my shoulder somewhere along the river road, worn out the way a person is worn out only after finally putting down something heavy they have been carrying a long while. I stayed awake the whole ride, watching the hedgerows slide past in the last gray light, and at one point Morwenna turned from the front seat and reached back to take my hand, the same gesture she had made in the sawdust 2 weeks before, except that this time there was nothing serious in her face at all, only a kind of astonished tenderness, as though she were still working out how to hold what had just happened. "I am never going to be able to properly thank either of you," she said quietly, so as not to wake Torin. "Do you understand that? I asked you both to carry a promise that was, I think now, rather too heavy for children to carry, and instead of breaking it, you found a way to keep it and still set things right. I do not know many grown men and women who could have managed that as gracefully as the two of you did today." "We just told the truth," I said, echoing Torin without quite meaning to. "Yes," she said, and her voice caught just slightly on the single word. "That is precisely the extraordinary thing you did, Maelin. Most people, faced with an unfair story, reach for something louder than the truth, an argument, a grievance, a fight. You reached only for what actually happened. I hope you never lose that instinct. It is rarer than people think, and it is worth more than almost anything else I could wish for you." I did not have an answer for that, so I only leaned my head against her shoulder for the rest of the drive, and she let me, and neither of us said anything more, because there did not seem to be anything left that needed saying aloud. The picnic by the river happened the very next weekend, foals and all, and Morwenna herself packed the honey cakes, laughing when Torin asked, with perfect innocence, whether Master Bevan's water-wheel theory had ever actually been settled. She still teaches me to press flowers between the pages of her old botany books most Sunday afternoons, and she comes herself always to say good night. And if either of us is ever the slightest bit careless near something that might genuinely hurt us, she still kneels down, still speaks low and steady and serious, still waits for the promise before she lets the matter go. Nothing about her actually changed in the end. Only the kingdom's understanding of her changed, and even that, I have come to think, was never quite the point. The point was smaller and closer to home than any headline, that she had corrected us because she loved us enough to bother. On an ordinary Saturday nobody was ever meant to notice at all, and that when the world finally did notice, and got it wrong, we were the ones who knew her well enough to set it right. Della Hartwick sent a letter to the palace some weeks later, not for the newspapers this time, just for Morwenna, and I know only because Morwenna told me herself gently that it was a kind letter, and that she had written back. I like to think of the two of them somewhere in that exchange, a queen consort and a wool merchant, neither of them the villain the other had first believed, finding their way to something like understanding the ordinary, unglamorous way most understanding actually arrives, slowly, honestly, and after the cameras have gone. The press, for its part, moved on to some other story within the fortnight, the way it always does, and I confess I felt a small, ungenerous flicker of satisfaction, the first time I noticed a headline about someone else's misfortune occupying the space that had so recently been filled with ours. Grandfather told me gently that he understood the feeling but did not think it was one worth holding onto, and that the healthier thing in the end was simply to be glad the storm had passed rather than glad it had landed on someone else's roof. I have tried to hold to that since, though I will admit it is easier counsel to agree with than to fully live by. Master Corwin sent round, a few weeks later, a short private note to the household thanking Torin and me, in his careful official language, for what he called an act of communication no press office in the kingdom could have engineered, which made Torin laugh so hard at the formality of it that he had to read it aloud to me twice. My mother and father returned from the coast 3 days after the prize-giving, having followed the whole business from a distance with what my mother later admitted was a great deal of frustration at being too far away to help. My mother came to find me the evening they arrived, sat on the end of my bed the way she used to when I was smaller, and asked me to tell her everything, start to finish, in my own words rather than the version she had already read in the papers. I told her about the sign I had not read, and the rope and Morwenna's hand around my arm, and the sawdust and the promise and all of it, right through to the rope line at the prize giving and the sound the crowd made when it went quiet. She listened without interrupting, the way Torin had listened to me that first morning, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment and then said only, "I am so proud of you I hardly know where to put it," which is a strange thing to say and exactly the right thing, and I have never forgotten it. Rilla found me at our next shared lesson and apologized, awkwardly, in the way children apologize when they are not entirely sure what they are apologizing for beyond the general sense that they got something wrong, and told me her mother had watched the full footage from the prize giving and taken back what she'd said at supper that week, in front of Rilla specifically, which Rilla seemed to think was the important part. I told her it was all right and meant it, because I had decided by then that most people who believed the unfair version of the story were not unkind so much as simply too far away to see the whole of it, the way Della Hartwick had been, and that anger at strangers for believing an untrue thing seemed, in the end, like a heavier weight to carry than the truth itself had ever been. Master Bevan, for his part, made good on his promise to Torin. My brother spends most Saturday mornings at the clockmaker's workshop in Fenbridge now, when lessons allow, elbow-deep in brass gears far more complicated than the little water wheel that started it all, and Master Bevan tells anyone who asks that the boy has a genuine gift for it, which Torin repeats to anyone who will listen with a pride that is, I think, entirely earned. He has never once in all the months since interrupted the old man again. Mistress Ivy asked us both, some weeks after it was all over, whether we had learned anything from the whole ordeal worth carrying forward. In the gently probing way she asked such things when she wanted us to arrive at a lesson ourselves, rather than simply hand it to us. Torin said, after some thought, that he had learned people will believe almost anything if it is short enough and shocking enough, and that the only real defense against that was patience, and the willingness to let the whole truth arrive in its own time, rather than chasing after every unfair headline with a denial of your own. I said, when it was my turn, that I had learned something smaller and perhaps more selfish, that I would rather be the sort of person who is occasionally corrected firmly and loved constantly than the sort who is never corrected at all, because I had watched, that autumn, exactly what it cost a woman to be publicly punished for offering me precisely that kind of steady, unglamorous care. Mistress Ivy told us both that she thought we had each landed on the truer half of the same lesson, and did not press either of us further, which was, I have come to think, its own kind of wisdom. We went back to Fenbridge the following autumn, all four of us, for the next Founders' Fair, and I will admit I watched the crowd more carefully that year than I ever had before, half expecting to feel the same watchful murmur I remembered from the prize giving. It was not there. It was only a fair again, cider and sawdust and Master Bevan's brass gears and the sheepdog trials, and when Morwenna knelt down, quite unremarkably, to retie the lace on a small stranger's shoe near the ribbon table, nobody reached for a telephone at all. Della Hartwick had her wool stall in its usual spot, and when we passed it she came around the table to greet Morwenna properly, and the two of them spoke for a few minutes like the acquaintances they had become, and I remember thinking that this, more than anything printed in any newspaper, was what it actually looked like when a wrong thing was finally set right. Not loudly, not with fanfare, just two women who had once been strangers to each other's true character, talking easily in the autumn sun. Torin brought Master Bevan a small clockwork bird he had built himself that year, gears he had cut and fitted on his own Saturday mornings, and the old man wound it up right there at the stall and let it hop along the counter while half the fair gathered to watch, and I do not think I have ever seen my brother look prouder of anything in his life. I helped Morwenna judge the harvest drawings again that year, going down the row exactly as we always had, crouching to ask each small artist about their pumpkin or their apple tree as though it were the most important picture in the world, because to that small artist, for that moment, it was. As for me, I think of that whole strange fortnight now less as a scandal, and more as the season I learned what my brother already seemed to know instinctively, that the truth, told plainly by someone who was actually there, is stronger than any 22 seconds trimmed to fit a story someone else wanted to believe. I was 9 years old, and I had never once thought of myself as someone whose word could matter to anybody beyond my own family. I know better now. Morwenna taught me, that day at the horse paddock, to be careful of what could hurt me. It was only fair, I have always thought since, that I got the chance to return the favor.